The blood had dried on her temple by the time the vultures started circling, their dark wings casting shadows across the rocky ditch where Catherine Lawson lay half-conscious in the unforgiving Arizona sun. It was the spring of 1878, and the stage route between Eager and St. John's had become treacherous territory, where outlaws preyed on travelers with ruthless efficiency, leaving their victims to the mercy of the desert. Catherine's fingers twitched against the sandy earth as consciousness flickered in and out like a dying candle, her mind trying desperately to piece together the chaos of the attack that had left her ribs bruised, her shoulder dislocated, and her hope shattered alongside the stagecoach that now lay overturned 50 yards up the trail. Russell Fairmont had been tracking the Henderson gang for 3 weeks, following their bloody path from Socorro County through the Arizona Territory, his sorrel gelding carrying him steadily through terrain that would have broken lesser horses. He was 26 years old, lean and weathered from years working cattle ranches before becoming a tracker for hire, his reputation built on persistence rather than speed. The morning sun beat down on his hat as he guided his horse along the stage route, eyes scanning for any sign of recent activity, when he spotted the dark birds wheeling overhead in that particular pattern that meant only one thing. His heart kicked hard against his ribs as he spurred his mount forward, hand instinctively checking the Colt revolver at his hip. The overturned stagecoach came into view first, its wheels pointing skyward like the legs of a dead animal, luggage scattered across the hard-packed earth, papers fluttering in the hot breeze. Then he saw her, a crumpled form in pale blue fabric that had been torn at the shoulder, lying in a drainage ditch where she had either crawled or been thrown. Russell was off his horse before it fully stopped, boots hitting the ground hard as he scrambled down the rocky slope. His first thought was that he was too late, that the stillness of her body meant death had already claimed her. But then he saw the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the slight movement of her fingers against the dirt. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark blonde hair that had come loose from its pins, her face smudged with dust and blood. "Madam," he said urgently, dropping to his knees beside her. "Madam, can you hear me?" Catherine's eyelids fluttered, and a soft moan escaped her cracked lips. Her hazel eyes opened briefly, unfocused and glazed with pain, before closing again. Russell quickly assessed her injuries with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tended wounded men on cattle drives. The head wound looked worse than it probably was, already clotting, but the angle of her left shoulder concerned him, and the way she held her ribs suggested bruising or possibly a fracture. "I am going to lift you now," he told her, even though he was not sure she could understand him. "We need to get you out of this sun." He slid one arm beneath her knees and another behind her back, careful to support her injured shoulder, and lifted her as gently as possible. She cried out, a sharp sound of agony that cut through him, her right hand clutching weakly at his shirt. Russell carried her up the slope to where his horse waited patiently, sweat already darkening the animal's coat. Getting her onto the horse was the hardest part. He settled into the saddle first, then reached down to pull her up, positioning her sideways across his lap so her head could rest against his chest. She was barely conscious, her breathing shallow and rapid, and he could feel the fever heat already building in her skin. Eager was the closest town, perhaps 8 miles northwest, and Russell turned his horse in that direction, keeping the pace steady but not too fast, one arm wrapped securely around the woman to keep her from sliding. He could feel every shuddering breath she took, the trembling in her limbs that spoke of shock setting in. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he found himself talking to her, a low, steady stream of words meant as much to comfort himself as her. "You are going to be all right," he said, though he was not entirely certain it was true. "My name is Russell Fairmont, and I am taking you to the doctor in Eager. You are safe now. Those men are long gone, and you are safe." The miles passed with agonizing slowness. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into something thick and oppressive. Russell stopped once at a small creek to wet his bandana and press it against her forehead, dribbling a few drops of water onto her lips. She stirred at the touch, her eyes opening again, and this time they focused on his face with something approaching awareness. "Who?" she whispered, the word barely audible. "Russell Fairmont," he repeated. "I found you by the stage route. What is your name?" "Catherine," she managed, then winced as pain lanced through her. "Catherine Lawson." "Well, Miss Lawson, you just hold on. We are almost to Eager." She nodded slightly, then her eyes closed again, and Russell felt a spike of fear that she might be slipping away. He urged his horse into a faster walk, feeling the animal's fatigue, but knowing they could not afford to stop. Eager appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its scattered buildings shimmering in the heat. It was a small town, established barely 4 years earlier by Mormon settlers, with a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, and a few dozen houses spreading out from the center. Russell headed straight for the doctor's office, which occupied a narrow building between the general store and a boarding house. "Doc Henderson," Russell shouted as he reined in his horse, his voice cracking with urgency. "Doc." A man emerged from the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth, his expression shifting from annoyance to alarm as he took in the scene. Dr. Marcus Henderson was in his 50s, with graying hair and the tired eyes of a man who had seen too much suffering, but his movements were quick and sure as he reached up to help Russell bring Catherine down from the horse. "What happened?" the doctor asked, supporting Catherine's weight as Russell dismounted. "Found her in a ditch along the stage route. Looks like the Henderson gang hit another coach." Russell came around quickly to help carry her inside. "She has been out here for hours, maybe since yesterday evening." They brought her into the examination room, a clean space that smelled of carbolic acid and lye soap. Doc Henderson worked quickly, cutting away the torn sleeve of her dress to examine her shoulder, probing her ribs with careful fingers while Catherine moaned and tried weakly to push his hands away. "Shoulder is dislocated," the doctor said grimly. "2 ribs cracked, maybe 3. Head wound is superficial, but she is severely dehydrated and going into shock. Help me hold her down while I set this shoulder." Russell positioned himself at Catherine's head, gripping her right shoulder and speaking softly to her, even as Doc Henderson took hold of her left arm. "This is going to hurt," Russell told her honestly, "but it will be over quick." Catherine's eyes locked onto his, and he saw the fear there, the pain, but also something else, a core of strength that had kept her alive through the night. She gave a tiny nod. The doctor pulled and rotated in one smooth motion, and Catherine's scream echoed through the small building. Then it was done, her shoulder back in its socket, and she went limp, unconscious again. Russell found that his hands were shaking as he released her. "She going to make it?" he asked quietly. Doc Henderson was already wrapping her ribs with long strips of cloth. "If infection does not set in, if her lungs are not punctured, if she can keep water down." He glanced up at Russell. "You got her here in time. Another few hours in that sun and we would be having a different conversation." Russell nodded, relief washing through him so strongly it made his knees weak. He stepped back to give the doctor room to work, watching as the older man cleaned and bandaged the head wound, checked her pupils, listened to her breathing. Finally, Doc Henderson covered her with a clean sheet and straightened up with a sigh. "She needs to stay here for at least a week, maybe 2. I will watch for fever and make sure those ribs heal properly." He studied Russell with knowing eyes. "You planning to stick around?" "I should report this to the marshal," Russell said, though he found himself reluctant to leave. "See if we can get a posse together to go after those men. Marshal Garrett is up in St. John's dealing with a land dispute. Will not be back until next week." Doc Henderson washed his hands in a basin of water. "Town council might authorize a posse, but most folks here are farmers, not fighters. Henderson gang is long gone by now anyway." Russell knew it was true, but the anger still burned in his chest. "They left her to die." "They did," the doctor agreed. "But you found her and she is alive. Sometimes that has to be enough." For the next 3 days, Russell barely left the doctor's office. He slept in a chair beside Catherine's bed, leaving only to tend his horse and grab meals from the boarding house next door. He watched her fight through the fever that came on the second night, her body shaking with chills one moment and burning up the next, her voice crying out for people he did not know. He pressed cool cloths to her forehead and helped Doc Henderson spoon water and thin broth between her lips, willing her to keep fighting. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Russell had dozed off in his chair, head tilted back against the wall, when he heard her voice, weak but clear. "You are still here." His eyes snapped open to find Catherine looking at him, truly awake for the first time since he had found her. Her face was pale and drawn, her lips chapped, but her hazel eyes were focused and aware. Russell sat forward quickly, relief flooding through him. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I was thrown from a stagecoach and left in a ditch," she said, and the ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Which I suppose is exactly what happened." Russell found himself smiling back, surprised by the warmth that spread through his chest. "You remember it?" Catherine's expression sobered. "Most of it. We were heading from St. John's to Springerville. There were 4 other passengers. 3 men stopped the stage about an hour before sunset. They shot the driver and the guard before anyone could react." Her voice trembled slightly. "One of them, he had cold eyes like looking at a snake. He made us all get out and line up. He shot Mr. Peterson, the banker, just shot him for no reason at all. Then he started going through our belongings." Russell listened quietly as she continued, her words coming faster now as if she needed to get them out. "I had a locket, my mother's locket. He tried to take it and I fought him. Stupid, I know, but I just reacted. He hit me with his gun and I fell. I remember the stagecoach tipping over. I think the horses bolted. Then everything went dark." She looked at Russell with those steady hazel eyes. "You saved my life." "I just happened to be riding that way," Russell said, uncomfortable with the weight of her gratitude. "You could have kept riding," Catherine pointed out. "Most men would have. They would have figured I was already dead, or that stopping would make them a target too." She reached out with her right hand, wincing at the movement, and touched his arm. "Thank you, Russell Fairmont." The touch of her fingers against his shirt sleeve felt like a brand, warm and electric. Russell found himself acutely aware of everything about her. The way her hair fell across the pillow, the freckles scattered across her nose, the determination in her expression despite her obvious pain and exhaustion. "You are welcome, Catherine Lawson," he said softly. Doc Henderson chose that moment to bustle in, his expression brightening when he saw his patient awake. "Well now, this is what I like to see. How is the pain, Miss Lawson?" "Considerable," Catherine admitted, "but bearable." "Good, good. Let me check those ribs." The doctor shooed Russell out of the room while he examined Catherine, and Russell found himself pacing the front office like an expectant father, anxious, until Doc Henderson emerged with a satisfied nod. "She is healing well. Young and strong, that helps. She will need another week of bed rest at least, then several more weeks of limited activity." "I do not have anywhere to go," came Catherine's voice from the other room, and both men heard the worry beneath her words. My belongings were on that stage, everything I owned. I was traveling to Springerville to take a teaching position at the school there, but I missed my start date. They have probably hired someone else by now. Russell stepped back into the doorway. Then you will stay here in Eager until you are healed. We will figure out the rest after that. Catherine opened her mouth to protest, probably to say something about propriety or not being a charity case, but Russell held up a hand. You almost died. You need time to recover. Everything else can wait. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. But I will find a way to repay you, and Doc Henderson, for everything you have done. As the days passed and Catherine grew stronger, Russell found himself spending more and more time at the doctor's office, far more than was necessary or proper. He would sit beside her bed and they would talk for hours, sharing stories of their lives with an ease that surprised them both. He learned that she had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress, both lost to cholera 2 years earlier. She had sold their small house to finance her journey west, seeking a fresh start and the opportunity to teach in the growing settlements of the Arizona Territory. I wanted adventure, she told him with a rueful smile. I suppose I got more than I bargained for. Russell told her about his own past, growing up on a ranch in West Texas, learning to track and hunt from his father before the older man died in a riding accident. He had drifted for a few years, working cattle drives and ranch jobs, before finding his calling as a tracker. He told her about the wide open spaces he loved, the satisfaction of finding what others thought was lost, the quiet companionship of his horse under the endless sky. You ever get lonely? Catherine asked one afternoon, sunlight streaming through the window and painting her face gold. Russell considered the question. Sometimes, he admitted, but I always figured lonely was better than settling for the wrong person just to have company. That is remarkably wise, Catherine said, and something in her expression made his heart beat faster. By the end of the second week, Catherine was able to sit up for extended periods and even walk slowly around the room with Russell's support. Her ribs were healing well, though they still caused her pain when she moved too quickly, and the bruising on her face had faded to yellow and green. Doc Henderson declared himself pleased with her progress and mentioned that she would soon be well enough to move to the boarding house if she chose. Neither Catherine nor Russell seemed eager for that transition. It was Russell who finally acknowledged what was growing between them. He had left the doctor's office to give Catherine privacy while she bathed and changed into one of the dresses the ladies of the town had donated. And when he returned, he found her standing by the window, looking out at the dusty Main Street. The late afternoon light caught in her hair and something in Russell's chest tightened painfully. Catherine, he said quietly, and she turned to face him. I need to tell you something. She waited, her hands clasped in front of her, those hazel eyes watching him steadily. Russell took a breath. I've been tracking men for 3 years now, never staying in one place more than a few days. I told myself I liked it that way, the freedom, no ties to anything or anyone. But these past 2 weeks, sitting here with you, talking with you. He paused, searching for the right words. I realize I was not free at all. I was just avoiding the risk of caring about someone. Catherine took a small step toward him. Russell, I know this is not the right time, he continued, the words tumbling out now. You are still healing, you have lost everything, and I am just some drifter who happened to find you. But I cannot let you leave without telling you that I care about you, more than I have ever cared about anyone. These feelings, they are not from gratitude or duty or anything like that. They are real and they are powerful, and they scare me half to death. For a long moment, Catherine said nothing, and Russell felt his heart sinking. Then she closed the distance between them, moving carefully because of her ribs, and took his hand in both of hers. "You think I do not feel the same way?" she asked softly. "Russell, when I woke up that first time and saw you there, I thought you were a dream. Then when I realized you were real, that you had stayed with me through everything, I started to understand what it means to trust someone completely." Her eyes were bright with emotion. "I am not going to pretend this is not complicated. I have nothing to offer you, no money, no position, no home. But if you want me, if you truly want me, then I am yours." Russell lifted his free hand to cup her face gently, mindful of the fading bruises. "You are all I want," he said simply, and then he kissed her. It was a careful kiss, tender and sweet, full of promise rather than passion, but it sealed something between them that words could not capture. When they pulled apart, both were smiling, and Catherine rested her forehead against his chest with a contented sigh. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Russell said, "we figure out how to build a life together." The practical realities of their situation became clear over the next few days. Russell had some money saved from his tracking work, enough to rent a small house on the edge of town for a few months. Catherine could not take the teaching position in Springerville, but the schoolteacher in Eager was an elderly widow who welcomed the offer of an assistant, especially one as educated and capable as Catherine proved to be. It would not pay much, but combined with whatever work Russell could find locally, they could manage. More complicated was the question of marriage. Both of them wanted it, but Catherine insisted on waiting until she was fully healed, until they had known each other longer than a few weeks, until she could walk down whatever aisle they found in a dress that was hers rather than borrowed. Russell argued that he did not care about any of that, but he also understood her need for things to be done properly, to have something in her life that happened the way it was supposed to happen. "We will do this right," Catherine said firmly one evening as they sat on the porch of the house Russell had rented, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "We will court properly, give ourselves time to be sure, let the town get used to seeing us together. Then, when we are both ready, we will marry." Russell reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "However you want it, that is how we will do it." The next 3 months were a study in restraint and growing affection. Russell found work with a local rancher who needed an extra hand during the busy spring season, mending fences and moving cattle to summer pasture. It was good, honest work that kept him in town rather than wandering the territory, and he found he did not miss the solitary life at all. Catherine threw herself into teaching, working with the younger children during the day and helping the older students in the evenings, her natural warmth and intelligence making her beloved by both students and parents. They saw each other every day, meeting for lunch when they could, taking walks together in the evening, attending church on Sundays side by side. The town watched them with the usual small-town curiosity, but most folks seemed pleased to see the young woman who had survived such an ordeal finding happiness, and Russell's steady, respectful courtship of her earned him widespread approval. It was not always easy. Catherine still had nightmares about the attack, waking in the night with screams trapped in her throat, her heart racing with terror. Russell would sit with her through the worst of it, holding her hand and reminding her that she was safe, that those men were long gone, that he would never let anyone hurt her again. Slowly, the nightmares became less frequent, though they never disappeared entirely. Russell, for his part, struggled with his own demons. The anger he felt toward the men who had hurt Catherine burned like a coal in his chest, and he found himself lying awake at night imagining what he would do if he ever found them. He had to consciously choose to let that anger go, to accept that justice might never come for those men, that holding on to rage would only poison what he was building with Catherine. They talked about these things, late at night on her porch or his, their voices low and honest. They learned each other's fears and dreams, their habits and preferences, the small details that make up a shared life. Russell discovered that Catherine loved thunderstorms, but was terrified of spiders. Catherine learned that Russell could not carry a tune to save his life, but had a gift for whittling, his knife transforming scraps of wood into birds and horses with remarkable skill. "Make me something," Catherine said one evening, watching him work. "What would you like?" Russell asked, his knife moving steadily across the piece of pine in his hands. Catherine thought for a moment. "A dove, for peace." Russell nodded and set to work, and over the next week the dove took shape under his patient hands. When it was finished, he presented it to her polished smooth, its wings spread as if in flight. Catherine held it carefully, her eyes shining with tears. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "I will treasure it always." That night, Russell asked her to marry him properly, dropping to one knee on her porch with the sunset painting the sky behind him. He had no ring yet, but he had his heart in his hand, his voice steady as he spoke. "Catherine Lawson, I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You are the strongest, kindest, most beautiful woman I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I am worthy of your trust. Will you marry me?" Catherine pulled him to his feet, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Russell Fairmont, I will marry you." They set the date for late June, giving them time to prepare and save a bit more money. Catherine wrote to distant cousins in Missouri, inviting them, though she doubted they would make the long journey. Russell had no family left to invite, but half the town seemed determined to attend, charmed by the romantic story of the cowboy who had saved his bride from certain death. The weeks before the wedding flew past in a whirlwind of activity. The ladies of Eager rallied around Catherine, helping her sew a wedding dress of cream-colored cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Russell bought a new suit and had his best boots polished until they shone. They found a small house to rent on the north end of town. 2 rooms with a kitchen and a porch that looked out over a meadow where horses grazed. The ceremony took place in the small Mormon church on a bright Saturday afternoon, with what seemed like the entire town crammed into the pews. Catherine walked down the aisle on the arm of Doc Henderson, who had agreed to stand in for her father, and Russell felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She looked radiant, her face glowing with happiness, her eyes locked on his. The service was simple and heartfelt, conducted by the local bishop who spoke about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of building a life on foundations of faith and love. When it came time for the vows, Russell and Catherine spoke them clearly, their voices steady, their hands clasped together. "I, Russell, take you, Catherine, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. I, Catherine, take you, Russell, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." Russell had managed to buy a simple gold band from the general store, and he slid it onto Catherine's finger with hands that trembled slightly. Then the bishop pronounced them husband and wife, and Russell kissed her to the sound of cheering and applause. The celebration afterward was held in the yard behind the church, with tables laden with food brought by every household in town. There was music and dancing, with Russell leading Catherine through a careful waltz, mindful of her still healing ribs. They cut a cake that Mrs. Henderson had baked and toasted with cider, and accepted congratulations from what felt like an endless stream of well-wishers. As the sun began to set, Russell and Catherine slipped away, walking hand in hand to their new home. Inside, someone had left flowers in a vase on the table, and the bed was made up with fresh linens. Russell closed the door behind them and turned to his wife, this woman who had changed his entire world. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. Catherine smiled, moving into his arms. "Happier than I ever thought possible." That night, they consummated their marriage with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless, learning the contours of each other's bodies, the rhythm of shared pleasure. Catherine's ribs had healed enough that she could move freely, though Russell was still careful with her, attentive to any sign of discomfort. They fell asleep tangled together, Catherine's head on Russell's chest, his arms wrapped protectively around her. The following months saw them settle into married life with surprising ease. Catherine continued teaching, her salary now supplementing the household income in a meaningful way. Russell took on more work with the rancher, proving himself valuable enough that he was offered a permanent position as the ranch foreman, with a significant increase in pay and a small house on the ranch property if they wanted it. They discussed the offer carefully, weighing the benefits of more money and security against the independence of their current situation. In the end, they decided to accept, recognizing that the opportunity was too good to pass up. They moved to the ranch in late summer, settling into a cabin that was slightly larger than their previous home, with a barn for the horses Russell now tended as part of his duties. Life on the ranch was different from town life, more isolated but also more peaceful. Catherine missed her students, but found satisfaction in helping Russell with the horses, discovering that she had a natural way with the animals. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the stars come out, talking about their dreams for the future. "I want children," Catherine said one night, her voice soft. "I know we have not talked about it much, but I do. I want to fill this house with the sound of little voices and laughter." Russell kissed her temple. "I want that too, a whole house full of children if we are blessed with them." Their first child came the following spring, arriving on a warm April morning after a labor that lasted most of the night. Russell paced outside the bedroom door while Doc Henderson attended Catherine, his heart in his throat every time he heard her cry out. When the baby finally came, a lusty squall announcing his arrival, Russell burst through the door without waiting for permission. Catherine lay exhausted against the pillows, her hair damp with sweat, but her face was radiant as she held their son. "Russell," she said softly, "come meet your boy." Russell approached almost reverently, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in his wife's arms. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, angry face, his little fists waving in the air. When Russell carefully took him, feeling the solid weight of this new life they had created, something shifted fundamentally in his chest. "He is perfect," Russell whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Catherine, he is perfect." They named him Thomas Russell Fairmont, after Catherine's father, and he became the center of their world. Russell would come in from working the ranch and head straight for his son, lifting him high in the air and making him laugh, changing diapers and walking the floor with him when he was fussy. Catherine nursed him and sang to him, marveling at every milestone, every new sound and expression. 2 years later, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth. She had Catherine's hazel eyes and Russell's stubborn determination, and she ruled the household from the moment she drew breath. Thomas adored his little sister, bringing her toys and trying to make her smile, and Russell and Catherine watched their children grow with hearts full of gratitude. Life was not without its challenges. The ranch went through a difficult period when drought hit the territory, and Russell worked longer hours to keep the cattle alive and the operation running. Money was tight, and they had to make sacrifices, but they faced it together. Their partnership strengthened by adversity rather than weakened. Catherine started a small school on the ranch, teaching not only her own children but also the children of the other ranch hands, giving them the education they would not otherwise receive. It was unpaid work, but it filled her with purpose, and Russell supported her completely, even building a small schoolroom onto their cabin so she would have proper space. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Thomas grew tall and lean like his father, with a gift for working with horses that made Russell proud. Sarah became a voracious reader, consuming every book she could get her hands on, her quick mind and quicker tongue keeping everyone on their toes. A third child joined them when Thomas was 7, and Sarah was 5. Another boy they named Henry James, who was quieter than his siblings but no less loved. Through it all, Russell and Catherine's love for each other only deepened. They still had their quiet evenings on the porch, now sometimes interrupted by children needing attention, but the core connection between them remained strong. They had learned to communicate without words, to support each other through difficulties, to celebrate each other's successes. Catherine sometimes still had nightmares about the attack, though they were rare now, softened by years of safety and love. When they came, Russell would hold her just as he had in those early days, his presence a solid anchor against the memories of fear. She would wake and look at him, at the life they had built together, and marvel at how something so terrible had led to something so beautiful. Russell, for his part, never forgot the day he found her in that ditch. Sometimes he would look at Catherine teaching their children or laughing at something Sarah said, and he would remember how close he had come to never knowing her, to riding past that spot on the trail and continuing on his solitary way. The thought made him hold her tighter, appreciate her more fully, never take for granted the gift they had been given. When Thomas turned 10, he asked his father to tell him the story of how his parents met. They were sitting by the creek that ran through the ranch property, fishing poles in hand, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. Russell was quiet for a moment, considering how much to tell his son. Finally, he said, "Your mother was in trouble, and I was lucky enough to be in the right place to help her. Sometimes life puts you exactly where you need to be, even when you do not realize it at the time." "Ma says you saved her life," Thomas said, his young face serious. "She saved mine too," Russell replied. "Not in the same way, maybe, but just as surely. Before I met your mother, I was just drifting through life, not really connected to anything or anyone. She taught me what it meant to have a home, to have a family, to have a purpose beyond just getting through each day." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I am glad you found her, Pa." "So am I, son," Russell said softly. "So am I." As the children grew older and more independent, Russell and Catherine found themselves with more time together again, their relationship evolving into something deeper and richer than it had been in those early passionate days. They knew each other completely now, every fault and virtue, every habit and quirk, and they loved each other not despite these things but because of them. They took to riding together on Sunday afternoons, leaving the children in Sarah's increasingly capable care and heading out into the countryside that had brought them together. Catherine had become an excellent rider over the years, confident and skilled, and she and Russell would race across the open meadows, their laughter carrying on the wind. One such afternoon, when Catherine was 38 and Russell 42, they stopped at the top of a ridge overlooking the valley where Eager lay in the distance. They had been married for 16 years, and their life together had been fuller and more rewarding than either of them had dreamed possible. You ever wonder what would have happened if you had ridden past that day? Catherine asked, her hand in Russell's as they stood looking out over the vast landscape. Russell shook his head. "No," he said simply. "Because I did not ride past. I stopped and I found you, and everything that matters to me now came from that choice. Wondering about anything different seems like a waste of the life we have." Catherine leaned against him, and Russell wrapped his arm around her waist. "I used to think the attack was the worst thing that ever happened to me," she said quietly. "But now I realize it was what brought me to you, to this life, to our children. I would not change it, even if I could. Even knowing all the pain and fear, I would not change it because it led me here." "You are the strongest person I know," Russell told her, kissing the top of her head. "And I fall more in love with you every single day." They stayed on that ridge until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, then rode home together in the gathering dusk, their horses moving in easy synchronization. When they arrived at their cabin, they could see lights in the windows and hear the sound of their children's voices, Thomas teaching Henry to play the harmonica while Sarah called out corrections and encouragement. Russell and Catherine paused before going inside, taking a moment to appreciate this life they had built from nothing but determination and love. Then, hand in hand, they walked through their front door and into the warmth of their home, ready for whatever the rest of their lives would bring together. The years continued to pass in a steady rhythm of seasons and celebrations, hardships and joys. Thomas grew into a fine young man, taking on more responsibilities at the ranch, and showing the same steady reliability his father had always possessed. At 19, he began courting a young woman from town, the daughter of the banker, and Russell and Catherine watched with knowing smiles as their son fell in love with the same wholehearted intensity his father once had. Sarah proved to be brilliant, her sharp mind and quick wit making her a natural teacher like her mother. At 17, she announced her intention to attend the new teachers' college that had opened in Flagstaff, and though it meant being away from home, Russell and Catherine supported her dream completely. They scraped together the tuition money, supplementing it with funds Sarah herself had saved from helping with bookkeeping at the ranch, and sent her off with tearful goodbyes and fierce pride. Henry, at 12, was quieter than his siblings but possessed a gift for drawing and observation that sometimes startled his parents with its insight. He filled sketchbooks with detailed renderings of ranch life, capturing moments and expressions with remarkable skill. Catherine encouraged his artistic bent, ordering art supplies from catalogs and displaying his work proudly on the cabin walls. Russell and Catherine entered their 40s with grace, their bodies marked by time and hard work, but their spirits still young. Russell's hair was beginning to gray at the temples, and Catherine had laugh lines around her eyes that deepened when she smiled. But they moved through life with the confidence of people who knew themselves and each other completely. The ranch continued to prosper under Russell's management, and when the owner died suddenly of a heart attack, his widow offered to sell the property to Russell at a price they could almost afford. It required taking out a substantial loan and tightening their belts for several years, but Russell and Catherine agreed it was worth it to have true security, to own the land they had worked so hard to improve. The day the paperwork was finalized, Russell came home and swept Catherine into his arms, spinning her around despite her laughing protests that they were too old for such behavior. "We did it," he said, his voice full of wonder. "We own a ranch, Catherine. Our own place, our own land. Nobody can take this from us." Catherine cupped his face in her hands, her eyes shining. We have built something real, you and I, something that will last beyond us, something our children and grandchildren will benefit from. I am so proud of what we have accomplished." That night they celebrated quietly, just the two of them after the children were asleep, toasting with whiskey and talking late into the night about their plans for the future, the improvements they wanted to make, the legacy they wanted to leave. They made love with the tender passion of long familiarity, their bodies knowing exactly how to please each other, and fell asleep wrapped together as they always did. Thomas married his sweetheart when he was 21, and Catherine and Russell gained a daughter-in-law they genuinely loved, a sweet girl named Margaret who fit seamlessly into their family. A year later, their first grandchild arrived, a beautiful baby girl named Catherine Rose, and Russell held his granddaughter with tears streaming down his face, marveling at the continuation of life and love. Sarah returned from college with her teaching certificate and a passion for educational reform, immediately starting work to improve the schools in the territory. She was fierce and determined, and reminded Russell so much of Catherine that it sometimes took his breath away. She remained unmarried, focused on her career, and though some in town whispered about her being a spinster, Catherine defended her daughter's choices vigorously. "She knows what she wants from life," Catherine told Russell one evening when someone had made a cutting comment at church. "She is not going to settle just to make other people comfortable. I admire that about her." "She gets it from you," Russell pointed out, and Catherine smiled. Henry, at 16, surprised everyone by announcing he wanted to study art formally, perhaps even travel to San Francisco or Chicago to attend art school. It was an unusual ambition for a ranch boy, and Russell initially struggled with the idea of his youngest child pursuing such an uncertain path. But Catherine reminded him that they had always encouraged their children to follow their dreams, and Russell came around, promising to support Henry however he could. Life on the ranch continued its familiar patterns, but Russell and Catherine made time for themselves as well, still taking those Sunday rides when weather and obligations permitted, still sitting on their porch in the evenings and talking about everything and nothing. Their relationship had matured into something solid and comfortable, but the spark between them never fully dimmed. Russell could still make Catherine laugh until she cried, and Catherine could still surprise Russell with her depth of insight and compassion. When Catherine turned 45, Russell planned a special celebration, gathering their entire family and half the county for a party that lasted well into the night. He made a toast, his voice carrying across the crowd gathered in their yard, speaking of the incredible woman who had survived an attack that should have killed her, who had built a life and a family from nothing, who had taught him what it meant to truly love someone. 20 years ago, Russell said, his eyes on Catherine, I found a woman in a ditch and thought I was saving her life. But the truth is, she saved mine. Everything good in my life, everything worth having, came from that moment when I decided to stop instead of riding past. Catherine, you are my heart, my home, my everything. Happy birthday, my love. Catherine stood and kissed him, not caring who was watching, her arms around his neck and tears in her eyes. The crowd cheered and applauded, and the party continued with renewed energy. But Russell and Catherine stayed locked in their embrace for a long moment, the rest of the world fading away. As they entered their 50s, Russell and Catherine began to think about succession and legacy. Thomas was more than capable of running the ranch, and he and Margaret had given them 3 more grandchildren to spoil and dote on. Sarah had become a force in territorial education, serving on boards and committees, making real change in how children were taught. Henry had indeed gone to San Francisco to study art, and was beginning to make a name for himself with paintings that captured the spirit of the West with startling accuracy. Russell and Catherine reduced their workload gradually, hiring more hands and delegating more responsibility, but they never fully retired. The ranch was in their blood now, as much a part of them as their own heartbeats. They still rose early and went to bed late, still checked on the horses and walked the property, still worked side by side as they had for decades. When Russell turned 60, his joints began to ache in the mornings, a reminder that time was catching up with him. Catherine, at 56, moved a bit slower than she once had, her body bearing the marks of bearing 3 children and decades of hard work. But they were healthy and happy, surrounded by family and secure in their accomplishments. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done thousands of times before, Catherine said softly, "We have had a good life, have we not?" Russell took her hand, his thumb tracing the familiar lines of her palm. "The best life," he agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "Do you have any regrets?" Catherine asked. Russell thought about it seriously, reviewing the decades they had shared, the choices they had made, the paths taken and not taken. Finally, he shook his head. "None that matter. There are things I might have done differently, mistakes I wish I had not made, but nothing that would change who we became or what we built together." "You," Catherine smiled. "Only that I wish we had more time. However many years we have left, it will not be enough." "Then we will make the most of every day," Russell said, pulling her close. "Starting right now." They sat together as the stars came out, one by one, the vast Arizona sky spreading above them like a benediction. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and one of the horses whinnied in response. The night air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of sage and juniper. Russell thought back to that day so long ago when he had found Catherine broken and bleeding in a ditch by the side of the road. He remembered the surge of determination that had driven him to save her, not knowing that in doing so he was saving himself. He remembered carrying her to safety, her weight in his arms, the desperate hope that she would survive. Everything that mattered had flowed from that single decision to stop, to look, to care enough to act. His children, his grandchildren, this ranch, this life, all of it traced back to that moment of choice. Russell had tracked many things in his life, but the most important trail he had ever followed had led him straight to Catherine. "I love you," he said, the words as heartfelt as they had been the first time he said them, decades ago. Catherine turned her face up to his, her hazel eyes reflecting the starlight. "I love you too," she whispered. "Always and forever." They stayed on the porch until the night grew cold, reluctant to let go of the moment, then went inside to the warmth of their home. That night they made love slowly and tenderly, celebrating not just their passion but their history, every shared moment and weathered storm that had brought them to this place. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed they had shared for over 30 years, Catherine's head on Russell's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you," Catherine said quietly, her breath warm against his skin. "For what?" Russell asked, his fingers trailing through her hair. "For finding me," she said simply. "For staying, for loving me through everything, for giving me this life." Russell tightened his arms around her, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for letting me," he replied. "Thank you for choosing me, for building this life with me, for making every day an adventure worth living." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, just as they had faced everything else. The years had not diminished their love, but instead had refined it, distilled it down to its purest essence, something strong enough to weather any storm. The ranch continued to thrive under Thomas's capable management, and Russell and Catherine settled into the role of beloved elders, dispensing wisdom and spoiling grandchildren with equal enthusiasm. They watched their family grow and flourish, each member carrying forward the values they had worked so hard to instill: honesty, hard work, compassion, and the importance of family. Sarah eventually married at 35, surprising everyone by falling for a widowed professor at the teachers' college, a man who appreciated her brilliance and independence. They had one child, a son, late in life, and Sarah balanced motherhood with her educational work with the same fierce determination she brought to everything. Henry's paintings began to sell for significant sums, and he achieved a level of fame that none of them had anticipated. But he never forgot his roots, returning to the ranch regularly and painting scenes from his childhood that captured the essence of their family story. Russell lived to see his 70th birthday, celebrated with a massive gathering that brought together 4 generations of family and friends from across the territory. He gave a speech that had everyone laughing and crying by turns, speaking of the unexpected blessings life had given him, the way a single moment of compassion had transformed his entire existence. As he grew older, Russell's memory began to fade in small ways, forgetting names and dates, sometimes getting confused about what year it was. But he never forgot Catherine, never failed to recognize her face or the sound of her voice. She was the constant in his life, the anchor that held him steady even as other things slipped away. Catherine remained sharp and active well into her late 60s, still teaching occasionally, still managing the household, still caring for Russell with patient devotion as his health declined. She watched him grow frail with a sadness tempered by gratitude for all the years they had shared, determined to make his remaining time as comfortable and happy as possible. On a warm spring evening, much like the evening they had first kissed so many years ago, Russell and Catherine sat on their porch together, his hand clasped in hers. Russell had been quiet that day, more tired than usual but insistent on watching the sunset. Catherine sat beside him, studying his beloved face, memorizing every line and feature even though she knew them as well as her own. "Catherine," Russell said softly, his voice thin but clear, "you made my life mean something. Every good thing I ever did, every moment of happiness I ever had came from loving you." Catherine felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Hush now," she said gently. "You are not going anywhere yet. We have more sunsets to watch together." Russell smiled, that same smile that had captured her heart so long ago. "However many we have, it has been worth it, all of it, every moment." He died 3 days later, quietly in his sleep, Catherine holding his hand. He was 73 years old, and he had lived a full, rich life surrounded by love. The entire territory mourned his passing, remembering him as a man of integrity and compassion, a devoted husband and father, a pillar of the community. Catherine grieved deeply, but without regret. She had loved Russell completely, and he had loved her the same way, and their decades together had been marked by a joy and partnership that few people ever experienced. She knew how lucky she had been, how easily she might have died in that ditch all those years ago, how the trajectory of her entire life had changed because one man had been kind enough to stop and help a stranger. She lived another 8 years after Russell's death, active and engaged, dividing her time between helping Thomas run the ranch and visiting her far-flung children and grandchildren. She taught her great-grandchildren to read and told them stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive through her words. She still slept on her side of the bed, as if Russell might return at any moment to claim his spot beside her. When Catherine died at 79, peacefully in her sleep after a day spent playing with her great-grandchildren, the entire family gathered to celebrate her remarkable life. They buried her next to Russell on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the vast Arizona sky they had both loved. Her headstone read simply, Catherine Lawson Fairmont, beloved wife, mother, and teacher, 1855–1934. The ranch remained in the family for generations, each inheritor adding their own chapter to the story while honoring the legacy Russell and Catherine had established. The house where they had lived was preserved carefully, becoming a kind of shrine to their love story, with the dove Russell had carved for Catherine displayed prominently on the mantel. Their great-great-grandchildren would visit that house and hear the story of how their ancestors met, how Russell had found Catherine broken and dying in a ditch, how he had carried her to safety, and in doing so had found his own salvation. They would learn about the love that had sustained two people through decades of hardship and joy, the partnership that had built something lasting from nothing but determination and hope. The story became a family legend, passed down through the years, a testament to the power of compassion and the unexpected ways that love can enter a life. It reminded each generation that a single act of kindness can change everything, that choosing to stop instead of riding past can alter the course of destiny. In the end, what Russell and Catherine had built together was more than a ranch or a family, though it was certainly both of those things. They had created a legacy of love that rippled forward through time, touching lives they would never meet, inspiring choices they would never witness. They had proven that even the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, that survival is only the beginning of the story, and that true love, when tended carefully and honored deeply, can indeed last forever. Their story was not one of perfect people living perfect lives, but of flawed, human individuals who chose each other every day, who worked through difficulties instead of running from them, who built something beautiful from the ruins of tragedy. It was a story of second chances and new beginnings, of finding home in another person rather than a place, of love that grew stronger rather than weaker with the passing years. And if sometimes, on quiet spring evenings, visitors to the old ranch would swear they could see two figures sitting on the porch of the original cabin, hands clasped together as they watched the sunset, well, perhaps that was just a trick of the light. Or perhaps it was something more, a reminder that some loves are too powerful to be contained by a single lifetime, that the bonds forged in adversity and strengthened through years of partnership leave an imprint on the world that time cannot erase. The ranch still stands today, a working operation that has weathered drought and depression, war and change, but never lost sight of the values that founded it. And in the family cemetery on the hill, two headstones stand side by side under the endless Arizona sky, marking the resting place of Russell Fairmont and Catherine Lawson Fairmont, a cowboy and the woman he found in a ditch, who together created a love story for the ages.